And we are live. Welcome everybody to our very first performance roundtable in the source code group. I'm very excited to have this kickstart here as well. We have been doing this on code review, and now we are doing it in source code too. So I want to start by giving an introduction of the call, exactly like establish the goals and establish what we're trying to do here. The idea of the call is to have a regular conversation about performance topics, whatever they may be. So anybody is open to propose topics to being discussed. The best idea is just to use the label, open an issue with our label, which is performance round table : source code. If I could type, that would be amazing. So I'm adding it there. So if you open an issue with that and add the workflow refinement, we can then go to our board. Give me just a second so I can get this ready to share the screen, and I can show you to the recording as well. So in our agenda, we have a link to the board, right? And in this board, what we're looking for is issues with performance roundtables, source code, and then the workflow refinement list will show everything that is being refined, so to speak. So if you have any proposals, any crazy ideas that you want to start put up for consideration, the best way to do it is like open an issue, label it with these two things, and then present it in the next call. That'll be the best way. And again, the idea for topics to be discussed could be repurposing already existing code, could be just something you heard about and you want to validate across disciplines between backend and front end. Anything really that could benefit performance, or just stale issues that we haven't picked up. Anything is relevant here. So that's why it started anybody who's interested in performance in our group. And I think that's good for now.
Andre,
does anybody have questions?
Yeah, I have a comment or a thought. So your approach suggests that we already know what we want to do. In the issue that I created based on the proposal of, I think, Dennis and other people, Sean, I believe, I outlined a proposal how we find out what are actually issues, to propose a process how we would identify what we should focus on to prevent that we're focusing on potentially improving the wrong things. Yeah.
Are you talking about the RICE framework, about having the reach, the impact, all that, or just overall what you're describing that issue?
Yeah, I don't know. Is everyone familiar with this issue that is linked here? I can briefly summarize. So basically,
Presented. Yes, I was going to ask you to get it recorded. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically I see two types of, and let me look at the issue myself so I don't tell you different things than the source of truth. So basically I see two types of opportunities. One opportunity type is about, really the interface performance, interfaces like web pages or other interfaces like APIs. We can just measure those and see how fast and slow they are. And we should measure how often they are being used. So we don't want to improve APIs that no one is ever calling, right? That would be a waste of time, even if they're super slow. And then the other one is workflow performance. And there was a long discussion by different people that chimed in and shared what's been done in code review. So looking at workflow performance, where we look at, okay, you have a certain goal in mind, like make a change in a certain file. You need to do certain steps to do that. How likely is it that users are having this task? And how long does it take to do this task, which is basically a sequence of API calls or web page loads. And then also, I guess also there's a mental load of finding the right things that you have to click. This is probably a bit harder, but understanding, is it a relevant workflow or not, right? So maybe it's unlikely that someone goes from the blame page to the commit list. But maybe not, right? So yeah, that's basically what this issue proposes. And I outline here 2 tables with ideas of, what things we should track here to make an informed decision of what we should focus on.
So with this,
so these are the tables. Just wanted to show that. Sorry, Dennis. Wanted to show the tables.
So it's technically the very first the first table about interface performance. I'm not sure whether it's it should be. So it's really about, from what I understand, it's about the loading performance of one individual page. This includes front end and back end. Plus, it is apparently, but I'm not sure whether it's covered here. So the performance of APIs, I have this point later in the agenda, but since it explicitly says interface, so I assume this is about page loading. So one single page, and then
I use the word interface to keep it open, right? Could be an API, could be a CLI call, could be could be a web page.
Right. So it's one individual thing, while the workflow performance is about how those individual things play together and how they perform with each other to achieve that or another task or goal by the user. Is this correct?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So technically, the interface performance, we do have, again, I have those points later in the agenda. I probably have to move those. If you don't mind, I will, since I'm gonna be mentioning those. So I moved those on the Torsten's item here. So technically, we have the Grafana dashboards where we measure over the course of, I think, a couple of years. We measure page loads. The metrics technically are tuned for front end, but every page has API calls behind itself, right? So technically analyzing the main abusers. So technically this first the LCP leaderboard shows all of the pages in the product that we measure, and unfortunately the 3 most severe abusers in this table are under our control. So source code routes. Those pages, technically, they provide more more generic view on the interface performance. It includes, as I said, front end and back end. So by drilling down that or another page, we can figure it out where actually the performance problem is, whether it's front end or back end, whether it's API or whether it's, I don't know, like JavaScript blocking the main thread. So different things. This provides the complex view on a particular interface. Then the next thing we have there is related to that workflow performance, which is called the user journey. I mentioned this in my comment in the issue. This is measurement of a sequence of actions. So opening a link, clicking that link, drilling down to, and in this particular case, drilling down to a file 2 levels deep in a folder. So that sort of thing. We can create any user journey we want and start measuring. At the moment, we measure only 2 scenarios, technically 1 scenario in 2 environments. The scenario we are measuring is loading a repo, clicking a folder, and getting to a file 2 levels deep in the folder structure and load that file. So this is the journey we are measuring in 2 environments, being large repository and regular repository. Those get measured now. The problem with both of this are, or rather the workflow, like when it comes to the single interface measurements, like individual view, we kind of have the metrics coming from the industry standards. So let's say in this particular case, Google tells us, okay, this parameter should not exceed this number, or this parameter should not exceed this number. So that's what we have in our in the core of our measurements of the interfaces. That's what we call LCP leaderboard. That's when we can judge whether any page has problem or not. It's more or less straightforward.
Again with Google. So those are like good practice rules, or what is?
Yeah. Those are like Google has some what they call advices, suggestions. The problem is that this is quite passive aggressive suggestion, namely websites get punished if you don't follow those. So they get worse rating, worse placement in the search results if your performance doesn't match the requirements from Google, for example. So it's those are requirements, but we do our best to follow those.
Are these only for static pages?
Those are for this is for loading performance. So performance of loading a page. So from sending the HTTP request to when the whole page is on the client with all the JavaScript processed, and so there are three main parameters we measure. LCP, largest contentful paint. This is the time to paint, to render the most significant element on the page, on the first screen of the page. There are a lot of nuances there, but Google is, and technically every performance technique is mostly interested in rendering the most significant content on the very first screen for the user. Users don't care what goes on under the fold, on the second, third screen of the page, but the point of them getting to a page is quite specific. If we talk about getting to a blob view, what they expect is to see the blob. They don't expect to see the navigation. They might not care about navigation. They might not care about search. If they get to the blob view, they want to see the blob. They go to repository, they want to see the list of the repository files and trees. If they get to edit a file, they want to see the editor. They don't care about, again, like navigation or my profile icon and avatar being loaded right away. So those things are considered significant for that or another route, and LCP metric, largest contentful paint, is responsible for measuring what, like, here comes some voodoo magic. Nobody really knows what is considered to be significant, right? However, Google strictly defines the largest contentful paint. So it's the rectangular area where we have either image or text, which it might be an area without text, but with different color, different from the background. The problem is that Google, by stating this really strict definition, Google kind of says, okay, we are easy to trick. And that's what I achieved for, actually, I think it was the repository view. At some point, we had a repository, repo view was the biggest abuser for some time before Jacques began with some performance work there. But taking that information from Google, what we did was, in order to improve the statistics, we didn't have capacity to improve the performance, but we wanted to trick the statistics. So what we did was we increased the description on the page, which technically increased the contentful paint element on the page. And that description was coming from Rails application. So the numbers went low immediately, because before that increase of the text, so you just write rubbish in the description field, and that rubbish is going to be considered your largest contentful paint on the page. So that's
But can I ask, So for us, it's not relevant whether Google lists us in the search or not, because the pages that we're talking about are anyway highly dynamic pages, and typically for logged in users only. Some are not, you don't need to be logged in. So we don't need to, cheat on these numbers to get a better search result, because we're not interested in the search result here for these kinds of pages, right?
Exactly. The way why
to make the users happy.
Yeah, the reason why I cheated on that particular case was, first of all, as I said, we didn't have capacity to fix it for real, and second, we were really sad to see those really high numbers, like really slow performance on the LCP leaderboard, and the team was bugging us on the application performance sessions that, well, these pages need some attention, and then we kind of brought the result. But what's the point here is that we do not necessarily this comes to my next question, like, what is the point here? Do we want to get good statistics? Do we want to improve performance for the users? And if in both of these cases, what particular performance do we want to improve? Because there are so many things. Again, we can employ psychological tricks to make users think that the page is fast. However, the page will, in the statistical data, the page will be somewhere really, really low. So there are a lot of things when it comes to performance that we can employ depending on our goal. And I think my personal take on this is that the very first thing with these performance roundtables, we have to identify what is the goal. What do we want to achieve? Is it to really improve performance for the users? Is it to really improve performance for the users and really improve statistical data? This is the most tedious and most labor-intensive way of improving performance. Or is it just, maybe in some cases, make users think that the page is faster, but at the same time, we do not really deliver the fastest result when it comes to the absolute numbers?
So Dennis, there's a few things I want to add, because you have these conversations also with the quality team, because if we're tracking a really large file, in this case, it doesn't make sense to evaluate it as if to expect it to have a 100 milliseconds response time, right? We have to accommodate the metrics accommodate the expectations to the examples that we're targeting. So one of the questions I have here in the agenda is, one of the things we did in the merge request was looking at the sizes of the merge requests statistically and checking the percentiles of the sizes. And essentially we targeted the 99th percentile or 90th percentile, I can't remember what it was, which eventually gave us a merge request with, X amount of comments, X amount of files changed, X amount of lines. I don't think we've ever done that with the source code files per se, looking at the whole percentile set of data. That's one. The other, like you said, the other comment I want to add here, explaining the difference, just to see how fickle and how how untrustworthy these metrics could be. It's the code owner's box that is changing that metrics perception, where the larger file is faster for the LCP than the smaller file, because the smaller file, as far as I can see, doesn't have, one of them has the code owners and the other doesn't. So I'm guessing that that's probably where the distinction comes from.
It also might relate to the fact I'm actually not, I haven't drilled down to the data between and difference between the blob, like small blob and large blob, but it might be exactly that thing with the LCP. So if the code owners becomes the largest contentful paint, if we split the a large blob in chunks, right? That's what we do. Then the code owners might become the largest contentful paint, and it just takes a lot of time for it to load. But this is the thing. This means that we should not prioritize code owner's block on the blob view. Like people come there to view the blob. Code owners is secondary.
It's the other way around. Sorry, Dennis, to cut you off. It's the other way around. We don't prioritize the code owners. That's the last thing we load. And because that becomes the largest thing, On the smaller file, it becomes later than previous.
Okay. Let's talk with
So,
design
Torsten,
design people and make it style it so tiny that it's not considered largest
tiny,
computable page.
5-pixel size. So, Torsten, this story might be useful for you. One time we had those popovers for the milestone 15.0 release thing come along on the pages, and that threw off the LCP metrics on a bunch of pages because that became the largest content on the page. Just so you get an idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think your proposal to look at percentiles of file sizes is really good. It gives us one dimension of what is relevant, right? It's not relevant to have like enormously large files or super small files if those are not relevant. And the other dimension is if a page is being used or not. But for the case of the repo pages, the blob page and the directory page, we know that those are heavily used pages, so that's already clear. Yeah.
Okay, we should put that in an issue and follow up in the next session. Dennis.
Yeah, I think I might have missed this, but when you talked about percentile, you meant about percentile of the users, right? Like we use in the LCP. No, I mean when Andrea talked about percentile, there are these different approaches to measure performance. So like you get the absolute number for one file, but then you can produce the metrics for example for 90th percentile. So 90% of the users will get this speed of loading this particular page.
Yeah.
That's
in this case, isn't users, it's file sizes. So essentially, it's looking at grabbing at the old. It could be based on page views, like Torsten was saying, but essentially looking at all the files being viewed in the last 30 days, 90 days, whatever. Checking the size of the files that were being accessed on GitLab.com, and eventually seeing what's the largest one, what's the smallest one, layer them out, and then seeing which are the biggest ones being accessed.
I'm a big proponent of taking at least two measurements, like take measurement on the smallest possible file and on the largest possible file to see how the current solution scales. Like we in this case, we might have a better understanding. Like if, for example, the largest file, like we had one case when the largest really large blob, I think it was blob, when that's when I was in contact with the quality team. The large blob took really long, about 30 seconds or something like this, because of all the parsing happening on the page. So it really helped to having that number to figure out where the problem is. Is it a backend that returns file very slowly because of its size, or is it front end? And with that big file, it was clear that front end was messing up the things because backend was very fast, no matter the whether the file is small or large. So having these two sort of polarized measurements helps a lot to have a perspective of scalability of the current solution.
Sure. I'll propose moving this discussion to an issue for the sake of time and moving on to your next facets of performance question, Dennis. There's some thought there from Robert.
Yes, this is the question that I've already mentioned. So what performance do we want to target? Like we can say we want to target any performance performance opportunity we see. That's totally fine. But do we have any idea of what performance? I don't say about particular view, but like what type of performance should we care about most?
Great question. I'll just share here for the recording's sake. Yeah, while we do think that most pages on our repository need to be super fast, and potentially in the first loading, the second is also important, but we also want it to be fast in the first. It is important to be mindful on the performance beyond the loading of the page. Like you mentioned before, the user journey is definitely important, which is something that we touch down below on the agenda as well. And then following the example of HTML5 spec, I have an example of what we could have sort of a priority of constituents defined, where We value the user's perceived performance above front-end metrics, above individual endpoint response times, because the response times on the endpoints could be super fast. If the front end is screwing up, the user will feel it. And then if we can have the perceived performance being faster for the user by doing some mimicry or some tricks, that is more beneficial than the front-end individual metrics. So I do think the perceived performance should be at the top, the endpoint should be at the bottom. But that's kind of like my response to
Thank
that.
you. Yeah,
Robert, anybody want to read
agree with that.
Robert's point?
Yeah, I can
Thanks.
do it since we have the mic. So Robert is writing that initial page load is where I often feel performance the most on applications, and what I try to aim for in my own applications. Unfortunately, it's also one of the biggest pain points at GitLab because of few things: large amounts of data, large amounts of markup being generated on the backend, etc. But with a combination of backend plus frontend changes, we could improve a lot over our current performance in this aspect. Yes, that's very true. And however, I'm not really. I don't think I can agree that generating a lot of markup on the backend is necessarily bad, because generating a lot of markup on the front end is so much more painful and is so much slower. And that's exactly what we experienced before. Then Robert has another point. I'm sorry.
I didn't know that. I thought if we changed, made more things into Vue rather than preparing the stuff on the back end, it would get faster. But is that not true?
It's nuanced.
It depends.
It's very nuanced.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on it depends on the complexity of the markup. If the markup is I'm afraid of getting way too deep technically about how the rendering works in the browsers, but the problem is that we get some information from so user sends the request, right, to the server. So server starts sending HTTP page, HTML page to the client, and then different sources get into play. There are some assets that need to be picked up from the server. There are some JavaScript modules that refer some other modules. So all of those things, after the initial response from the server, build up to this slow performance that we might experience. So what are the main abusers of performance? Large amounts of data, as Robert writes here. So, but the point is that once the data comes from the backend, it's not necessarily complex and time-consuming to generate the HTML on the backend on the server. The problem comes when that amount of data has to be rendered on the screen. That's the problem. Like rendering and painting on the screen, depending on a lot of nuances, can be very, very slow. So in some instances, generating huge amount of data on the backend and then outputting it on the front end can be very fast, because the data is about, I don't know, like the bunch of divs. Div. This will be more or less simple and fast. However, it might be that the data coming from backend is pretty simple, and then front end makes it complex, wrapping into different elements, HTML elements, adding some dynamic. The events like on mouse or on click added to every single element will dramatically slow down the page. So it all depends. It depends on each particular case. Sometimes front end is faster, sometimes back end is faster. But in most cases, like from my experience, in most cases, front end is the main abuser.
Yeah. Dennis, if I may add a few things to help Thorsten. Sure. So I'll share this. One important conclusion we got in the code review performance roundtables was distinguishing static content that is going to be static for the most lifetime of the page and dynamic And then the static one is more beneficial to pre-render on the back end. It can be cached. So that's the example of the syntax highlighting, which is one example that we can, again, in some ways benefit, but in other ways we pay the cost of transferring down that on the wire that will have a much bigger payload. So it's always a trade-off, right? Some cases it benefits, some cases it doesn't benefit. But more than anything, it's like Dennis was saying, it needs to be addressed in any particular cases. It matters whether you're pre-rendering this for the customers, other users will benefit from that pre-rendering, or is it something that the front end should do again? So it's complex to have a silver bullet solution for everything, but yeah. I'll stop there.
So just from my understanding, if I may ask one more question. So let's say I'm using Google Calendar or Google Mail. Does this stuff get pre-rendered on the backend and I get like a fully painted thing? Or there's just the text transferred and then this is being created on the front end?
I cannot really tell how Google does build it. But, yeah, if I could, I would probably build it as well. But the answer is it probably uses the combination. Andrea made a very good point about static versus dynamic content. So when it comes to Gmail, for example, there are elements that are just static, like the layout of the Gmail. That one is the perfect candidate to be just spit it out from the backend without front end really messing up and building it with something. This is just like the frame comes from the server, and then the dynamic data, like the number of the order of the folders, for example, in your inbox, that can be generated on the server as well, because that order is static. You do not reorder the things. However, the number of the items in your inbox, event listeners, like you click on this chevron or whatever it is to expand this section and things like this. Those are coming from the front end. So front end has to use the backend as the backend content coming from the backend as the base, and then build on top of that. And this is the thing. You've mentioned an interesting thing, like, if we move everything from Rails to Vue, this doesn't necessarily mean a better performance. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, this means worse performance. Why? First of all, it's additional JavaScript. Second, bootstrapping Vue happens only after the page has already been parsed.
When you say additional JavaScript, do you mean code needs to be loaded to my browser?
Vue components, yeah.
But if I visited this page today, then for all other pages, it will be the same, right? I mean, for all other, so if I went today to Google, to GitLab.org, and later I go to www.gitlab.com, then, the same application will be still cached in my browser, and therefore
it will be served from the applications usually are cached based on the domain. So the domain will be different.
He means groups. That is,
groups.
Yes, right. It will be cached.
Yeah. It's like if it's the same component, it will be cached. However, as I said, the cached will be just like the shell, sort of the HTML markup might be cached.
The engine.
However, the JavaScript and Vue application, that's why we use Vue application in order to build dynamic applications. And the dynamics of the application come from JavaScript. And JavaScript needs to parse different parts, pull in data, inject it into the page. And there are a lot of moving parts which make it really easy to screw up performance of it's not related to Vue or anything. Like, it's any framework makes it way too simple to screw up the performance of the things if you do not pay attention.
But in the end run, it pays off.
Thanks.
I think one important thing to understand, the repository pages is a great example of that. If we took before the HAML version of the repository pages, you'd first load the project overview, you click on a folder, you'd have to reload the whole page. and get to the second folder. That's faster now with the View app, right? Even if for the first load of the page, we might take some metrics and be a bit slower on some perspectives, the overall goal of the user is faster. That's why we refactor these things to have more dynamicism onto the page, so we can do more things without coming to the server and getting the whole page again. But like Dennis was saying, we need to be careful because a lot of the times the trade-offs are not there right away. If you compare a really small folder with 3 files, the performance might be worse with View. But if you compare with 3,000 files, the HAML version will be much, much, much slower, right? That's the trade-offs. That's why all of this depends.
This is a very good distinction again. So Rails, or like server-generated content, is suitable for static pages, which do not really change, or with very minimal dynamics, while Vue makes it really easy to have high velocity when developing dynamic things. For example, in context editing is impossible with Rails. Doing the batch loading of the repository, or like of a blob as it is now, would be nearly impossible with Rails. So there are things that Vue makes much simpler. It's just a matter of paying attention to how we structure and architect those applications.
Okay, thanks a lot. I understand now.
Robert had another point. Yes.
One quick question regarding the initial load time. So one of the ways to improve it is to move something in a background, and perform some operations like asynchronously. For example, we have a dropdown. A user don't see the content of the dropdown until they click it. They maybe even won't click this page. So we don't even need the content of the dropdown for this particular page load. It's just a question from front-end perspective. Are we sick of it? To move to do such dropdowns, or do we still want to do it or can do it?
It's very good, good example.
Or maybe a more specific question is: do we have like a threshold? For example, maybe sometimes it's not worth it to reduce like one SQL request into a Vue application. Maybe we have a threshold. I don't know, maybe it's in the milliseconds or the number of HTML SQL requests, or in complexity of a particular page. So we could make a decision whether to move this particular component into Vue or not.
This is a very good point. However, I'm not sure why we should be talking either or. So if we move some component into Vue, this doesn't mean that we should run, like, if getting back to that drop-down example, we do not have to render the content of the drop-down right away. That's not necessary, right? We can, again, make things on demand. So when user clicks, we send the SQL or whatever request to the server, and then present the content once we get the response. The only thing we have to care about is how to entertain user while they wait for this request, right? However, it will make things really faster if we do things on demand. It makes the initial page loading faster. So anything we can remove from the initial load, which is not essential, will increase performance. But it's not really related to the decision of whether we should have any threshold of moving to Vue, or number of Vue components or something like this. I think it's totally possible to achieve good results with both approaches.
And my answer is that, Igor, it's a great point. I don't think we're tired of it. I think it's still a strategy that works in most cases. So one of the examples is the compare page, where the target is exactly that, to listed branches, to select to compare it. still beneficial to first render it faster and then having that call asynchronous. So yeah, it still makes sense.
Great,
Cool.
thank you.
Robert had another one. I'll just read it very quickly just for the sake of time. So Robert says that diff rendering is still my personal target to improve. The highlighting, the redacting, etc., of this area is extremely costly, and yet the diffs are pretty much the product of the Git hosting platform. So they appear everywhere and are used an awful lot. And then I added that we should definitely put this in an issue to discuss in an upcoming call, so explicitly this topic in the context of source code, because there's a bunch of discussions going around in diffs in this code review side of things. So we should definitely unify knowledge and discuss the perspectives of it. Dennis, you have the next one.
Yeah, it's just a sort of the constant reminder about what we already mentioned, that we can always apply psychological tricks to performance. It won't necessarily make our numbers any better, but it might make our users happier with that before we actually find time to come back to that or another page and invest time into reducing the actual numbers. We can apply psychological tricks as the shield while we find time and resources to fix the performance for real. And of course, it's shameless brag there. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the psychological trick to make it appear faster is one aspect, but there's also the avoiding. I don't know what the opposite of a trick is. I can't come up with the word. Maybe it's shooting ourselves in the foot. So we had this situation where the section at the top that shows the code owners was, first painted, and then later the information from the backend came that showed, okay, it's actually 2 lines, and then it got bigger, and then that made all the stuff below move down, right? I think no one cares if this box at the top takes, I don't know, 2 or 3 seconds to render, but a lot of people care if it moves, right? So because most people will anyway look at the file content, not at the code owners. So we need to make sure that we're not, using anti-psychological effects to make things worse.
Yeah, Andret is typing faster than I speak. So it's one of those metrics from Google. It's called cumulative layout shift, where Google actually penalizes if you start moving elements later on. So if you output the elements, but then they start all of a sudden move around and get shifted, so you get penalized. So this is not the thing that I'm talking about.
No, but I like the metaphor of shooting yourself in the foot, because a lot of the times it's what we do.
Well,
I'll steal that.
At least that's something we're very, very good.
Okay. Thanks, Thorsten. So I'll move on to the next topic then. Again, we can come back to this later. I do invite everybody to create issues on topics you want to see discussed again, because that way we don't forget about them. So this next one, I wanted to ask the thoughts of people here about picking up this issue. Oh, I should have linked it. My bad. Let me try to find the link while I speak. So essentially, it's to add the find file into the main repository view app. This is still a separate component from our repository view app that we have unified with the blob rendering. And one of the benefits that this could bring is exactly going back and forth between a file tree, finding a file, go to the blob page, go back to the file tree. All of those journeys will be much shorter because you don't have to re-render the whole page again when you're going to find a file screen. So it's kind of like a leftover.
What do you mean by find a file?
Great
what do you
question.
mean by find a file, like search function, or? Yeah,
whenever you press T, right, it shows the fuzzy file finder of a file, of a repository, right? That's what I mean.
Okay,
that particular screen
just learned
being
something.
Brought that into. Oh yeah, it's amazingly powerful, and I would even venture to say that it's a very used feature. I don't have metrics to back that up yet in my screen, but I use it all the time. But I always die a little inside when I see the time it takes to go from the repository page to that. And when you're looking at those things, it's like teaching somebody to identify bad kerning. It will haunt them for the rest of their lives. And that's the same thing with performance. Yeah, Torsten, yeah, I'll stop talking. That's it.
Yeah, how does that
And-
align? I mean, do we, with our new navigation strategy, and I forgot what it's called, basically what you also have in VS Code, the command palette and the command palette.
right.
Do we actually still need this thing, or do we not need it anymore?
So I think there's different things. So eventually the command palette could invoke the find file as an option, as a command. And then it will go into that mode. But the trick of this is that very quickly, without touching anything, just using the keyboard, I can hit T and start typing the file name as I remember it, and then goes directly to that file. So it's a very decisive use case. I think the command palette starts a layer above, where it's like, what do you want to do? And then you have to say, find a file. But it could link each
Okay.
other up. I don't think they're exclusive. They're not the same thing. And even VS Code has two different things. One is the command palette, and the other is finding the file, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah. So this is a feature that already exists today. Yeah, they're different. Sorry, yeah, they're different things. Give me a second.
Hmm.
I can't remember it by heart, but I can remember.
What is the key? What is the key for a VS Code find file?
Command P.
Command P, I think.
Yeah.
Command P. Okay.
And then the command is Command Shift P.
The problem with the keystrokes is that they're different in different IDEs and editors.
Yeah.
Like in
right.
JetBrains, it's Shift for some arbitrary reason. I have no idea why, but it's always like.
But if I do it here in my VS Code, actually it opens at the same position. This search the window, this drop down.
Yeah.
So let me just share quickly. You want
Sure.
want me to share, or
Go for it? Yeah.
Good. Share. There's VS Code. Yeah. So I do.
Okay, we see
I
it.
do Shift P. That's the command palette, and I do P, and it's the search command P.
They're the
So
same
command-
UI, different functionality.
Same UI, yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of wondering, do we need do we want to adopt this? I mean, with this whole navigation, a lot of things become more seamless, I hope. And I could imagine that if we move this functionality here, it would be nice, right?
I think it's
Yeah, I'm trying to
question
think.
more to
Go ahead.
UX, to the designers to figure out whether it's discoverable enough. And because if we want to target this find file functionality towards advanced users of GitLab, then yes, probably doing it in the overlay like this would make sense. But I think this functionality is very useful for anybody, and hiding it into some sort of a command palette would be a bit too advanced. I think it like just placing the search field or something very visible above the file tree would make more sense. But that's, again, this is the question to the designers probably.
Let's mention Michael here.
Sorry, I was typing and I was getting typos everywhere. So I was going to say that I think it doesn't change the plan anyway. So we would always need to pull the find file into the repository app anyway, even if you want to use the command palette. So the way we would do it is bring the find file as it is right now into the repository app. Then later, if you do want to replace one with the other, once the command palette is, mature and shipped and whatever, and has the same functionality, we will replace the component of the find file. It would already be inside the repository app. So we would use that work that we would do now. Even if you want to do that you said, of using the same command palette.
I'm not sure I understand this. The command palette on this.
Let me rephrase it. So
wouldn't that
imagine that
have its own performance goals? Like it would
Separate
work
thing.
wherever you are, right?
Right.
And
But right now, the command palette would need to talk to the repository app to load the current state, to load the right state of the blob page, right? So there will have to be communication in that component between command palette and the blob viewer. What I'm thinking here
so
is
that the search is contextual, so that when I'm in a different branch, I'm only searching in that branch. Is that what you mean? Or if I'm already in a directory, I'm only searching in that directory. I see.
Yeah,
okay, I see.
No, wait a second. If you are in a directory, you still search the whole repo, but for this branch.
Branch, yes. Folder, no. Is that clear, Torsten? So it's contextual to the branch, but not to the file folder that you're in.
I have a question about the command palette. Is it available outside of the repo? Like, is it supposed to be available, for example, when you are in snippets, when you don't have context of the repo?
Everywhere.
That's the problem.
I would think it's everywhere.
That's the problem, because this means that
I'm speculating, so careful with this. Yep, so I think this must be a general thing.
If it is the thing, and the command palette is available anywhere in the project, this means that it has to be like, it will be different if we introduce something which requires the context of the repo. It will be different in different places. I'm not sure how comfortable it is for the users, because when you use command palette in the context of an IDE or VS Code, you are always within the repository context. So it's always there. However, in our case, the product is much broader than just the repository, right? And putting this functionality in the command palette might be a bit odd from the user experience perspective. But again, who am I to talk about the user experience?
I linked the epic, so feel free to go in there and take a read, and then we can share some thoughts there. Thanks for tagging Michael, Torsten, on that.
I'll finish that sentence.
So we need to wrap up. So Dennis, you said...
Yeah, it was just a comment that I think find file functionality in the repository would be super helpful. Yeah, it's specifically from the standpoint of performance, because this would make the journey of getting to that, like as we have now, file 2 levels deep, super fast. So you just type in the name of the file and you're there, without like drilling down.
All right, makes sense. Thanks. You have your last question, Dennis. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, that was the question. So we have this I'm aware of the dashboards for about the front end, more or less front end related performance, and I was wondering whether we have dashboards for the API endpoints, and I think there are links there, right? So we do measure that. That's great.
Cool. So that concludes the agenda. Right on time. Sorry for pushing you along, but this was great to have everybody on the call, especially talking about front end and back end and product and UX all at once. Everything, everywhere, all at once. See, but it was great to have you all in the first session of the Performance Roundtable for Source Code. So again, I'll wrap this up. If you have any objections to making this video public, do let me know. I'm going to be making it soon after this. Otherwise, have a wonderful time. We'll see you again here in 2 weeks. So this is not a weekly event, it's 2 weeks. If we feel like we have full agendas that we need to talk more about, we can make it weekly. But for now, we started with every 2 weeks. So I'll see you then, March 28th. Be there or be square.
Okay.
Bye.